The room was filled with Hollywood's most famous faces. Actors, musicians, producers, and wealthy businessmen moved between tables beneath enormous crystal chandeliers. Laughter filled the air, glasses clinked, and soft music played somewhere in the background. Then, Elvis Presley walked in. The conversations changed immediately. People turned. Some smiled, others whispered. Elvis was used to it. He had spent years becoming the man everyone wanted to see. But beneath the confident smile and famous appearance, there was still a part of him that wondered what people truly thought about his music. That night, he was about to find out. Later in the evening, someone noticed a piano near the center of the ballroom. "Elvis, play something!" Several guests joined in. "Come on, Elvis! Just one song!" Elvis laughed. "You people never give me a break." But eventually he sat down. The room slowly became quiet. There was no stage, no microphone, no spotlight. Just Elvis and a piano. He placed his fingers on the keys. Then he began to play. The melody was simple, 3 chords, nothing complicated. But when Elvis began singing, the room changed. Conversations stopped. People turned toward him. The young musicians in the room watched carefully. For a few minutes, nobody cared about Hollywood. Nobody cared about fame. They simply listened. When Elvis finished, the room exploded with applause. Elvis smiled and stood. Then a voice came from behind him. "Entertaining." Elvis turned. A well-known music critic stood there, holding a drink. Elvis smiled politely. "Thank you." The critic glanced toward the piano. "You have a natural ability to entertain people." Elvis's smile faded slightly. "But?" The critic smiled. "But entertainment isn't art." The room suddenly felt quieter. Elvis looked at him. The critic continued. "You have charisma, a good voice. You know how to capture an audience." Sounds like a compliment. It isn't. A few people exchanged uncomfortable glances. The critic pointed toward the piano. "Your problem is simplicity." Elvis raised an eyebrow. "My problem?" "3 chords." The critic shook his head. 3 chords can make people dance. They can make them shout. They can make them buy records." He paused. "But they can never create real art." Elvis stared at him. The critic delivered the final blow. 3 chords will never be art." Silence. The words hit harder than Elvis expected. He had heard criticism before. But something about this was different. Because the critic wasn't attacking his popularity. He was attacking the reason Elvis had spent his life playing music. Elvis looked toward the piano. 3 chords. That was all the man saw. But Elvis saw something else. He saw his childhood. He remembered gospel music. He remembered his family. He remembered the first time music had made him feel like he belonged somewhere. He remembered why he had started. And suddenly, he wasn't sure anymore. Maybe the critic was right. Maybe he was only an entertainer. Maybe the millions of people who loved his music didn't understand what real art was. Elvis forced a smile. "Maybe you're right." The critic smiled. "Of course I am." Elvis walked away. But the words followed him. 3 chords will never be art. Elvis stopped near a large window overlooking Hollywood. The city lights stretched endlessly below him. He stared at them. For years, people had told him what he was: a singer, an entertainer, a movie star, a sensation. But very few people had called him an artist. And perhaps, deep down, that bothered him. He had never wanted to be famous simply for being famous. He wanted his music to mean something. He wanted people to feel something. But now, one man's words had made him question everything. Then he heard a voice behind him. "That man always talk like he knows everything?" Elvis turned. John Wayne stood there. Elvis smiled. "You're John Wayne." Wayne raised an eyebrow. "Last time I checked." Elvis laughed. The tension disappeared for a moment. Then Wayne looked toward the critic. "He bothered you." Elvis shook his head. "No." Wayne stared at him. Elvis sighed. "Maybe a little." Wayne nodded. "I understand." Elvis looked at him. "You?" Wayne laughed. "I've been told I couldn't act." "Who told you that?" "Almost everyone." Elvis smiled. "And you listened?" "Sometimes." That answer surprised Elvis. Wayne continued. "That's the dangerous part." Elvis waited. Wayne looked directly at him. "People can criticize you once. That's nothing." He paused. "But if you hear the same thing long enough, eventually you start saying it to yourself." Elvis looked down. Wayne had touched something deep, something Elvis didn't talk about. Doubt, the kind that existed behind the fame. Wayne nodded toward the piano. "That man sees 3 chords." He looked back at Elvis. "I saw a room full of people who stopped talking." Elvis said nothing. Wayne continued. "I saw people remembering something." A pause. "Maybe the 3 chords aren't the art." Elvis looked at him. "Maybe what people feel when they hear them is." The words stayed with Elvis. Wayne smiled. "Don't spend your life trying to prove critics wrong." "Then what should I do?" Wayne gave him a simple answer. "Play." Elvis smiled. "That's it?" "That's it." Wayne started walking away. Then he stopped. "One more thing." Elvis looked at him. "If those 3 chords mean something to you," Wayne pointed toward the piano, "then they're worth playing." And he walked away. Elvis stood alone. He looked at the piano. Then he slowly returned to it. The ballroom was still crowded. Nobody expected him to play again. He sat down. He placed his fingers on the keys. Then he played the same 3 chords. Again and again. This time he listened differently. He didn't hear complexity. He heard memory. He heard his childhood. He heard the voices of people he loved. He heard the reason he had started singing in the first place, and suddenly the critic's words didn't seem so powerful anymore. Because Elvis realized something. The critic was measuring music. Elvis was feeling it. Those were 2 completely different things. As Elvis prepared to leave, the young singer who had spoken to him earlier approached. "Elvis?" He turned. "Yes?" The young man held his guitar nervously. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "How do I know if my music is good?" Elvis looked at him. For a moment he thought about giving him a technical answer. Instead, he smiled. "When you play it." The young man waited. "And someone feels something." The young man nodded. "But what if the critics don't like it?" Elvis laughed softly. "Then they don't like it." The young man smiled. Elvis placed a hand on his shoulder. "Don't try to make everyone happy." He looked at the guitar. "Just play something that's honest." The young man nodded. "Thank you." Elvis turned to leave. Then he stopped. "And don't try to be me." The young man laughed. Elvis smiled. "Be yourself." Then he walked toward the exit. Outside, Elvis entered his car. As the vehicle began moving, he looked back at the glowing ballroom. The critic was still inside. The young musician was still there. And somewhere behind them all was John Wayne. Elvis smiled. For the first time that evening, he no longer cared whether 3 chords were enough to impress a critic. He knew something more important. If 3 chords could make someone remember, if 3 chords could make someone feel less alone, if 3 chords could make someone believe in themselves, then perhaps they were enough. But Elvis didn't know what was happening inside that ballroom. The critic was still standing near the piano. He was staring at the keys. 3 chords. That's all he could think about. Then he heard footsteps behind him. The critic turned. John Wayne was standing there. Wayne looked at the piano, then at the critic. "So," he said calmly, "still think 3 chords can't be art?" The critic opened his mouth, but no words came out because suddenly he remembered something he hadn't thought about in decades. His father, a man who couldn't read music, a man who knew only a few chords, a man who used to sing the same simple songs every evening. And for the first time, the critic wondered, maybe Elvis hadn't been playing 3 chords. Maybe he had been playing a memory. The critic looked at John Wayne. Wayne simply smiled and walked away. The critic remained standing beside the piano, silent. For the first time in his career, he wasn't listening like a critic. He was listening like a son. And somewhere outside, Elvis Presley was driving into the Hollywood night, not knowing that the man who had tried to dismiss his music had just begun to question everything he believed about art. The next morning, Elvis couldn't stop thinking about the critic's words. 3 chords will never be art. He had heard criticism before. People had called his music too simple, too commercial, too emotional. But this time, the words had found a place inside him. Elvis sat alone with his guitar. He played 3 simple chords, then stopped. He thought about John Wayne. Maybe the 3 chords aren't the art. Maybe what people feel when they hear them is. Elvis played again. This time he remembered something. The young musician who had told him that Elvis inspired him to pick up a guitar. The fans who had written letters. The people who said his songs had helped them through difficult times. Maybe the critic was counting chords, but Elvis was counting memories, and memories couldn't be measured. A few days later, Elvis received an unexpected phone call. It was the critic. Elvis almost didn't answer. "Hello? Elvis?" There was an awkward silence. Then the critic said, "I owe you an apology." Elvis leaned back. "For what?" "For that night." Elvis smiled. "You said what you believed." "I thought I did." Elvis frowned. "What changed?" The critic took a breath. "Your music." Elvis didn't understand. "What about it?" "I couldn't stop thinking about those 3 chords." Elvis smiled. "That's unfortunate." The critic laughed. Then his voice became serious. "I remembered my father." Elvis became quiet. The critic explained that his father had never been a professional musician. He couldn't read music and knew only a few simple chords, but every evening he played them. His family would sit together and sing. The critic hadn't thought about those moments in decades, until Elvis played. "That's when I realized something," the critic said. "I spent my whole life trying to explain music." He paused. "My father never explained it. He just played." Elvis looked down at his guitar. The critic continued. "Maybe I was wrong about art." Elvis smiled. "John Wayne said something similar." The critic laughed. "Of course he did." Then the critic became serious. "He wasn't defending you that night." Elvis frowned. "What do you mean?" "He was defending me." Elvis said nothing. The critic continued. John Wayne saw that I was becoming a man who believed his opinion mattered more than everyone else's feelings. He paused. He reminded me that sometimes you have to listen before you judge. Elvis looked at his guitar. For the first time, he understood. John Wayne hadn't been protecting Elvis from the critic. He had been protecting the critic from himself. A few weeks later, Elvis returned to the ballroom. The room looked completely different without the lights and guests. The piano was still there. Elvis sat down. Then he heard footsteps. The critic appeared. For a moment, neither man spoke. Finally, the critic said, "I want to hear those 3 chords again." Elvis smiled. "Why?" "Because I think I missed something." Elvis placed his fingers on the keys. Then he played. 3 simple chords. The critic closed his eyes. He remembered his father, a small room, an old piano, his mother's voice. For the first time, he didn't think about whether the music was technically impressive. He simply listened. When Elvis stopped, the critic opened his eyes. "I understand now." Elvis smiled. "Understand what?" The critic looked toward the piano. "Art isn't always what the artist puts into the music." He looked at Elvis. "Sometimes it's what the listener finds inside it." Elvis nodded. Neither man needed to say anything else. The argument was over, not because one man had won, but because both had learned something. That evening, Elvis found John Wayne outside. "Leaving without saying goodbye?" Wayne turned. "Thought you were busy." "With what?" "Saving music with 3 chords." Elvis laughed. Then he became serious. "Thank you." Wayne looked at him. "For what?" "For standing behind me." Wayne smiled. "I wasn't standing behind you." Elvis frowned. "Then where were you?" Wayne pointed toward the ballroom. "I was listening." Elvis smiled. Wayne continued. "You didn't need me to defend you." He paused. "You just needed someone to remind you why you started." Those words stayed with Elvis, because that was the truth. He hadn't started singing to impress critics. He hadn't started playing to become famous. He had started because music made him feel something, and he wanted other people to feel it too. Months later, Elvis performed in front of thousands of people. The lights were bright. The crowd was enormous. But backstage he felt nervous. The old doubts had returned. What if the critics were right? What if people stopped listening? Then Elvis remembered the photograph the critic had given him. His father's piano. 3 chords, 1 lifetime of memories. Elvis smiled. He didn't need to prove anything. He only needed to play. He walked onto the stage. The crowd erupted. Elvis picked up his guitar and played 3 simple chords. For a moment, the audience became silent. Then he began to sing. Somewhere in the crowd, the critic listened. Somewhere backstage, John Wayne watched. And Elvis finally understood. The critic had been counting chords. John Wayne had been watching the man. But the audience was listening with their hearts. When the final note ended, thousands of people stood and applauded. Elvis smiled. He no longer cared whether 3 chords were enough to impress a critic. He knew they were enough to make someone feel something. And maybe that was all music ever needed to do. But as Elvis walked backstage, John Wayne was waiting for him. Wayne looked at him and smiled. "Ready for what's next?" Elvis laughed. "What's next?" Wayne looked toward the roaring crowd. "Now you have to do it again." Elvis smiled, but neither of them knew that the next performance would force Elvis to face the hardest question of his career. Not whether he was an artist, but whether he could remain Elvis. while the entire world kept trying to turn him into someone else. The question came sooner than Elvis expected. It happened after another major performance. The crowd had loved him. They had screamed his name. They had demanded another song. But backstage, Elvis wasn't thinking about the applause. He was thinking about the question everyone kept asking. How long could he remain Elvis Presley? Music was changing. New singers were appearing. New sounds were taking over the radio. And once again, critics began saying that Elvis belonged to another time. The words were different now, but the feeling was the same. You're not enough anymore. Elvis tried to ignore it, but this time something was different. He had learned not to let one critic define him. Now he had to face something much harder, the fear of becoming someone he no longer recognized. One evening, Elvis sat alone with his guitar. He looked at his reflection in the mirror. The famous hair, the famous face, the famous name. Everyone knew Elvis Presley. But did anyone still know the man behind the name? He picked up his guitar. 3 chords. The same 3 chords that had started everything. Then he stopped. He remembered John Wayne's words, "You need to know who you are before you listen to what people say." Elvis finally understood. He had spent years trying to become the Elvis everyone wanted. The fans wanted one version. The critics wanted another. Hollywood wanted another. The music industry wanted something else. And somewhere between all those expectations, the real Elvis had almost disappeared. He closed his eyes. Then he started playing. This time, he wasn't performing for anyone. Not the critics, not the fans, not even John Wayne. Just himself. And for the first time in years, Elvis felt free. A few days later, Elvis called John Wayne. "I think I know what you meant." Wayne laughed. "That's dangerous." Elvis smiled. "You said I needed to know who I was." "And?" "I think I forgot." Wayne became quiet. Elvis continued. "Everyone kept telling me who Elvis Presley was." He paused. "And I started believing them." Wayne understood. Then he said, "That's the price of becoming famous." "Then it's a terrible price." Wayne laughed. "Nobody said fame was cheap." Elvis smiled. Then Wayne became serious. "Listen to me." Elvis waited. "You don't have to stop changing. Change is part of life. But don't let other people choose what you become." Elvis looked down. Those words gave him courage. Maybe he didn't need to return to the Elvis of the past. Maybe he could become someone new. Someone who was still honest. Someone who still loved music. Someone who wasn't afraid to grow. Soon after, Elvis performed at a smaller venue. There were no enormous crowds, no spectacular stage, no pressure to recreate the past. Just Elvis, a guitar, a piano, and a room full of people. Before the performance, the old critic approached him. "Are you nervous?" Elvis smiled. "More than usual." "Why?" Elvis looked toward the stage. "Because tonight, I'm not sure what people expect." The critic smiled. "That's a good thing." Elvis looked at him. "Why?" "Because maybe tonight they'll finally hear you." Elvis understood. The critic had changed. He no longer listened for mistakes. He listened for truth. Elvis stepped onto the stage. The room became silent. He began with an old song, then another, and finally he played something completely different, something new, something that didn't sound like the Elvis people expected. When he finished, there was silence. For one terrifying second, Elvis thought he had failed. Then someone began applauding. Another person joined. Then the entire room erupted. Elvis smiled. He had done it. He hadn't tried to recreate his past. He had simply moved forward. After the performance, John Wayne found him backstage. Wayne looked at him. "That was different." Elvis smiled. "Good different?" Wayne nodded. "Very." Elvis laughed. Then Wayne asked, "Did you enjoy it?" Elvis thought about the question. "Yes." Wayne smiled. "Then that's all I wanted to know." Elvis looked at him. "That's really all?" "That's all." Wayne started walking away. Elvis stopped him. "John." Wayne turned. Elvis smiled. "Do you think my father would have liked it?" Wayne smiled. "I think he'd have understood it." Elvis nodded. That answer meant more than any review ever could. Later that night, Elvis returned to his hotel. The room was quiet. He placed his guitar beside the bed. Then he saw something on the table. A letter. It was from the critic. Elvis opened it. There were only a few lines. The critic wrote, "I used to believe artists had to prove themselves. Tonight, I realized something. The moment you stopped trying to prove who you were, I finally saw you." Elvis read the letter twice. Then he smiled. He folded it carefully, but before putting it away, he noticed something else. At the bottom was one final sentence. John Wayne was right about one thing. Elvis frowned. Then he read the rest. "The world will always tell you who you should be. The hardest thing is having the courage to remain yourself." Elvis looked toward the window. The city was quiet. For the first time, he wasn't afraid of the future. He didn't know what music would come next. He didn't know what the critics would say. He didn't know whether everyone would like it. And strangely, he didn't care, because he finally understood. He didn't need to remain the Elvis of yesterday. He only needed to remain honest. Years later, people would remember the night of the 3 chords. But Elvis would remember something else. He would remember the moment after the criticism, the moment when he almost believed it, and the man who stood behind him. John Wayne hadn't saved Elvis. He hadn't made his career. He hadn't written his music. He had simply reminded him of something that was already inside him, the courage to keep playing. And perhaps that's what friendship sometimes is. Not solving someone's problems, not fighting all their battles, just standing nearby long enough for them to remember who they are. Elvis picked up his guitar one final time that night. He played the 3 chords. Then he smiled, because now he knew. The critic had been wrong, not because 3 chords were automatically art, but because art was never about the number of chords. It was about the human being behind them, the person who played them, the person who heard them, and the memories created between them. Elvis had finally found his answer, but there was still one final conversation waiting for him, one conversation with John Wayne. And this time, Elvis would ask the question that had been troubling him for years. When everything else disappears, who am I? And John Wayne's answer would become the most important thing Elvis ever heard. The question stayed with Elvis for a long time. When everything else disappears, who am I? He had asked himself that question many times, but there was one person he believed might have the answer: John Wayne. It was late when Elvis finally found him. The 2 men stood outside, away from the crowds and cameras. For once, nobody was asking Elvis to perform. Nobody wanted an autograph. Nobody wanted a photograph. He was simply a man standing beside another man. Elvis looked at Wayne. "Can I ask you something?" Wayne smiled. That's usually how questions work. Elvis laughed. Then he became serious. When all of this is gone. Wayne waited. The fame, the money, the music, the movies. Elvis looked down. When nobody remembers my name, who am I? For a moment, John Wayne said nothing. Then he looked directly at him. You're the same man you were before anyone knew your name. Elvis frowned. Wayne continued. You're the boy who heard music and wanted to sing. He paused. You're the man who walked onto a stage when he was scared. Another pause. You're the person who kept going when people told you to stop. Elvis listened carefully. Wayne stepped closer. Fame doesn't make you who you are, Elvis. He pointed toward him. It only makes more people watch you. Elvis smiled faintly. Wayne continued. And when the lights go out, you're still you. Those words hit Elvis deeply. For years he had been afraid of losing his fame. But perhaps he had been afraid of the wrong thing. Maybe the real danger wasn't losing Elvis Presley. Maybe it was losing Elvis, the man underneath the name. Elvis looked toward the city. I spent so much time trying to prove myself. Wayne nodded. Everybody does. To critics. Yes. To fans. Yes. To myself. Wayne smiled. Especially yourself. Elvis laughed softly. Then he became quiet. I think I finally understand the 3 chords. Wayne raised an eyebrow. About time. Elvis smiled. They weren't important because they were complicated. Wayne waited. They were important because they were mine. John Wayne smiled. Now you're getting somewhere. Elvis continued. And if someone else doesn't like them? Wayne shrugged. That's their problem. Elvis laughed. For the first time, the question didn't frighten him anymore. He knew who he was. Not because a critic had approved him, not because millions of people loved him, not because John Wayne had defended him, but because he had finally stopped asking other people for permission to be himself. The next evening, Elvis had one final surprise. He invited the critic to meet him. When the man arrived, Elvis was sitting beside a piano. The critic looked at him. Another lesson? Elvis smiled. Maybe. The critic sat down. Elvis looked at him. Do you remember what you said that night? The critic smiled. Unfortunately. 3 chords will never be art. The critic nodded. I was wrong. Elvis shook his head. Not completely. The critic looked surprised. Elvis continued. You were right about one thing. The critic waited. 3 chords aren't automatically art. The critic smiled. Exactly. But you were wrong about something else. What? Elvis placed his fingers on the piano. Art isn't about how complicated something is. He played 1 chord, then another, then the third. The critic listened. Elvis looked at him. Sometimes it's about whether someone feels something. The critic nodded. Elvis continued. Sometimes it's about whether a song makes someone remember. The critic looked toward the piano. His father's face came back to him. The old room, the simple music, the people he had loved. He smiled. You're right, Elvis laughed. Don't say that too often. The critic laughed too. Then Elvis asked, Do you still think 3 chords will never be art? The critic looked at him. No. He paused. Now I think 3 chords can be anything. Elvis smiled. Anything? Yes. The critic looked at the piano. They can be a song, a memory, a goodbye, or the beginning of something. Elvis nodded. The critic smiled. And sometimes, he looked directly at Elvis, they can be enough. Years passed, the world changed, music changed, new stars appeared, new critics arrived, and Elvis continued to perform. But he never forgot that night, the night someone told him 3 chords could never be art. The night he almost believed it. The night John Wayne stood behind him. And the night a critic discovered that his own definition of art was too small. The story became something people told. Sometimes the details changed, sometimes people exaggerated, but the heart of the story remained the same. A famous singer, a harsh critic, 3 simple chords, and a legendary actor standing quietly behind them. But there was something most people never understood. John Wayne hadn't been there because Elvis needed saving. He had been there because sometimes even strong people need someone to remind them of what they already know. Elvis knew how to sing. He knew how to perform. He knew how to move an audience. What he had forgotten was something much simpler. He knew who he was. One evening, long after that famous conversation, Elvis sat alone with his guitar. No audience, no cameras, no spotlight. He played the same 3 chords. He smiled. Then he remembered the young musician he had once advised, the critic who had changed his mind, and John Wayne. Elvis wondered where that young musician was now. Then he heard a knock. A young man entered the room. It was the same musician, older now, more confident. He carried a guitar. Elvis smiled. "I remember you." The man laughed. "I was hoping you would." They sat together. The young musician looked at Elvis. "I never forgot what you told me." "What did I tell you?" "To play something honest." Elvis nodded. "Did it work?" The man smiled. "Sometimes." Elvis laughed. "That's better than nothing." The young man looked at him. "You know what I realized?" "What?" "Those 3 chords." Elvis raised an eyebrow. The man smiled. "I still play them." Elvis laughed. "Then I guess I wasn't completely wrong." "No." The young musician shook his head. "You weren't." He looked down at his guitar. "They became the first song I ever wrote." Elvis smiled. "Really?" The man nodded. "And my daughter sings it now." Elvis became quiet. The young man continued. "So I guess those 3 chords became part of my family." Elvis looked at him. For a moment he couldn't speak. Then he smiled. "That's art." The young musician nodded. "Yeah." And that was the answer Elvis had been searching for all along. Not long after, the critic received a letter. It was from Elvis. Inside was a photograph. Elvis sitting beside the piano. On the back, Elvis had written, "You were right about one thing. 3 chords aren't always art." The critic smiled. Then he read the next line. "But sometimes 3 chords can change a life." The critic stared at the words, and he thought about his father. He thought about Elvis. He thought about John Wayne. Then he placed the photograph beside the old picture of his father. 2 photographs, 2 men, 2 stories, connected by 3 simple chords. And John Wayne? Years later, when someone asked him about that famous night, he simply smiled. "Did you really defend Elvis Presley?" Wayne shook his head. "No." The interviewer looked confused. "Then what did you do?" Wayne thought for a moment. "I reminded him." "Reminded him of what?" Wayne smiled. "That he didn't need me." That answer was all he gave, because John Wayne understood something that night. Sometimes the greatest thing you can do for another person isn't to fight their battle. It's to stand close enough for them to remember that they can fight it themselves. Elvis never forgot those words. And perhaps that's why, whenever he played those 3 chords afterward, they sounded different. Not because the chords had changed, but because he had. The boy who once played music because it made him feel alive had become a man who understood why music mattered. The critic who once measured art by complexity had learned to measure it by emotion. And John Wayne, standing quietly behind Elvis that night, had given them both a lesson neither would ever forget. Art wasn't always found in complexity. Sometimes it lived in simplicity. Sometimes a song didn't need 100 notes. Sometimes 3 were enough. Enough to remember a father, enough to comfort a stranger, enough to inspire a young musician, enough to bring 2 old friends together, enough to make a room full of people stop talking and simply listen. And maybe that was the greatest truth of all. The critic had said, 3 chords will never be art. But Elvis had proved something much more powerful. 3 chords might not be enough to impress everyone, but if they can make someone feel, they might be enough to change everything. Elvis Presley never needed to win that argument, because in the end, the music had already answered it. And somewhere behind him, on that unforgettable night, John Wayne had been there to make sure Elvis remembered one final thing. The world may tell you who they think you are, but only you can decide who you become.